On the evening of April 14th, 1982, in a grey apartment block on Bukarestskaya Street, Leningrad, a 7-year-old boy pressed his ear against a wooden door. Behind it, his parents were whispering. Their voices trembled not with anger, but with fear. Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, the border, words that meant nothing to a child, but everything to the adults who spoke them. The boy's name was Dmitry Kazakov. His father, Anatoly, was an engineer at a defense research facility. His mother, Elena, a literature teacher. To the outside world, they were model Soviet citizens, quiet, obedient, loyal. But that night, they were making a decision that would cost them their lives. Dmitry didn't understand what he was hearing, only that something was wrong. His mother's voice broke when she said, "I can't raise him in a country where the future is already decided." His father answered quietly, "Then we leave, once and for all." When the door creaked, both parents froze. Their son was standing there, his eyes wide. Anatoly knelt beside him. "Dmitry, you must forget everything you heard. Promise me." The boy nodded. His mother wiped her tears and whispered, "It's just a trip, darling. Nothing more. You mustn't tell anyone." He promised, but promises made by 7-year-olds are fragile things. No one could have known that within 3 months that overheard conversation would reach the ears of the KGB, and that both Anatoly and Elena Kazakov would be executed by firing squad. And all of it because of something their son said to a friend on a summer afternoon. How did it come to this? How could a child's words become a death sentence? To understand what happened to the Kazakov family, we must return to the Soviet Union of 1982, the final years of the Brezhnev era, a period historians call the era of stagnation. It was a time when the system still looked solid from the outside, the red banners, the May Day parades, the speeches about progress, but inside, it was slowly collapsing. The economy was failing, corruption was spreading, and belief in the communist dream was fading. For ordinary people, daily life was a balance between loyalty and survival. To question the party was dangerous. To dream of leaving the country was unthinkable. Yet across the Soviet Union, quiet disillusionment had begun to spread, especially among the educated, those who saw what the world looked like beyond propaganda. In that world lived Anatoly Kazakov, age 37. He was a mid-level engineer at a Leningrad defense research facility. His job was technical, routine, and carefully monitored. He designed components for radio communications, not top-secret weapons, but still sensitive enough that his movements were regularly reviewed by security officers. He wasn't a dissident, nor an outspoken critic, but in private, he had grown tired of the grayness, the fear, the small humiliations of daily life. His wife, Elena, was 34. She had been teaching literature for nearly a decade. Her students loved her. She had a quiet warmth, an ability to make Pushkin and Tolstoy feel alive, even within the rigid curriculum of Soviet ideology. But teaching in the USSR was an act of balance. Every word could be dangerous. Encouraging free thought could be seen as subversion. She had once been reprimanded for allowing her students to discuss a banned poem, not because she was defiant, but because she believed literature should mean something more than slogans. Together, Anatoly and Elena were not rebels. They were ordinary, and that was the tragedy because it meant their downfall could happen to anyone. Their son, Dmitry, was born in 1974, a quiet, thoughtful boy with dark hair and solemn eyes. He attended the same local school where his mother taught. Teachers described him as serious, loyal, and overly mature for his age, a child who took rules and promises seriously, the kind who never lied. At home, the Kazakovs lived modestly in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a Khrushchev-era building. Concrete walls, narrow corridors, thin doors that carried every sound. Privacy was a luxury no one truly had. The neighbors were teachers, factory workers, retirees, the backbone of the Soviet middle class. Life was predictable, controlled, and carefully watched. But beneath that normalcy, something in the Kazakovs had begun to crack. Anatoly had grown restless. He'd seen enough of the bureaucracy to understand that nothing would ever change. Promotion depended not on talent, but on political loyalty. Every year brought more restrictions, more censorship, more fear. He watched colleagues get denounced for small mistakes, a misplaced comment, a joke, a letter from abroad. Elena saw the change in him. He stopped reading, stopped laughing, came home late and silent. They talked about leaving at first as fantasy, then as possibility. The idea terrified her, but it also gave her hope. If they could reach the West Austria, maybe even America, Dmitry could grow up free. He could choose his own life. But in the Soviet Union, defection was treason. Even talking about it was a crime. Still, by early 1982, they had made their decision. When a notice arrived approving their request for a family vacation to Bulgaria, they saw it as a chance. Bulgaria was part of the Eastern Bloc, but geographically close to Yugoslavia, and from Yugoslavia, the border to Austria could be crossed on foot through mountain passes. It would be dangerous, yes, but possible. Others had done it. They began to prepare in silence. Anatoly collected documents and cash, small valuables they could trade. Elena packed quietly at night, not just clothes, but things that spoke of finality. Family photographs, her mother's lace tablecloth, Anatoly's grandfather's watch. Dmitry noticed, though he didn't understand why someone would pack photo albums for a 2-week trip. There was tension at dinner, long silences. His parents spoke in whispers, their conversations stopping whenever he entered the room. A 7-year-old can feel when something is wrong, even if he can't explain it. And then came that night in April, the whispers behind the door, the promise to forget. From that moment on, the Kazakov household was a quiet theater of fear. Elena's hands shook when she marked her students' papers. Anatoly avoided phone calls, suspecting every line was tapped. They smiled for the neighbors, laughed at the right moments, and prayed that no one would notice their unease. But in a state built on suspicion, fear itself was dangerous. Every glance, every whisper could become evidence. Still, they continued. Their train to Bulgaria was scheduled for late May. They had just a few weeks to endure, a few weeks to keep the secret until they could vanish across the border. They believed their greatest threat came from the KGB. They were wrong. The threat would come from a place they never imagined, from a small courtyard on a spring afternoon, from their son's best friend. Because in a world where every word was dangerous, even the words of a child could kill. By early May 1982, the Kazakov family's apartment had become a stage of quiet panic. Anatoly and Elena rehearsed calmness like actors in a play, smiling for neighbors, nodding politely at colleagues, pretending nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, every movement, every word was filled with dread. They were less than 2 weeks away from departure, from freedom or from ruin. Dmitry felt it too. At 7 years old, he couldn't name the emotion, but he felt the heaviness in the air. His mother forgot to check his homework. His father barely looked at him during dinner. And the suitcases, why were they already half-packed? Why had his mother hidden jewelry in a jar of sugar? Why was his father whispering to strangers near the tram stop? Children notice everything. They just don't always understand. One afternoon, Dmitry came home from school and found his parents arguing in hushed tones. "Elena, you have to trust me," Anatoly said. "Once we reach Bulgaria, we'll have a chance. After that, no more pretending." His wife's voice broke. "And if we're caught, you know what they do to defectors. They'll call us traitors." Dmitry froze in the hallway, his heart pounding. He didn't know what defectors meant, but he knew it was something forbidden. That night, he lay awake, listening to the distant hum of the city. He thought about the promise he had made to keep their secret and how heavy that promise had become. It was too big for him. Too big for a child who wanted to tell someone what was happening, who wanted someone to tell him everything would be fine. A few days later, he found himself playing in the courtyard with his best friend, Mikhail Petrov. They had known each other all their lives, two boys growing up in the same gray block of apartments, sharing toys, secrets, and dreams. The courtyard was their world, a patch of cracked concrete, a rusted swing, and a low wall where they sat for hours, imagining adventures far beyond Leningrad. That day, Dmitri was quieter than usual. Mikhail noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. Dmitri hesitated, looking around as if someone might hear them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We're leaving. My parents and I, we're going west, and we're not coming back." Mikhail frowned, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "West? You mean for vacation?" Dmitri shook his head. "No, forever." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mikhail asked, "Does my father know?" Dmitri looked away. Nobody can know. But that evening, when Mikhail returned home, he told his father everything. He didn't mean to betray anyone. He simply thought he was doing what was right, what every good Soviet child was taught to do. To report anything unusual, to protect the state, to trust one's parents. His father, Sergeant Viktor Petrov, had been a police officer for more than a decade. He believed in rules, he believed in duty, and above all, he believed that loyalty to the state was loyalty to truth itself. When his son repeated Dmitri's words, Viktor listened carefully. He didn't scold the boy or dismiss the story as childish fantasy. He asked precise questions: where the conversation took place, what exactly Dmitri had said, whether anyone else had heard. Then, that same night, he sat at his desk and wrote a report. It was short, no more than half a page. He noted the source: information provided by my 8-year-old son, Mikhail Petrov. He described the content as second-hand, but potentially serious. He added that Anatoly Kazakov was employed in a defense-related facility and that the family had an approved trip to Bulgaria scheduled for May 27th. He signed it, stamped it, and sent it up the chain of command. Within 24 hours, the report reached the Leningrad branch of the KGB. To the officers who reviewed it, most citizen tips were meaningless, petty gossip, jealous neighbors, false alarms. But this one contained 3 details that made it different. Asterisk. The subject worked in the defense sector. Asterisk. He had an upcoming trip abroad. Asterisk. And there was mention of not returning. For a system built on paranoia, that was enough. A file was opened, case 4788K, and surveillance began immediately. KGB officers positioned themselves near the Kazakov's apartment building. They followed Anatoly to work, noting who he spoke with, what time he came home. They tapped the family's telephone, recorded every outgoing call. For days, nothing suspicious appeared. Anatoly was cautious, Elena withdrawn. But the KGB was patient. They knew that those who planned to flee eventually made mistakes. On May 20th, they found one. After work, Anatoly met a man at a small cafe by the Neva River. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. No documents changed hands. But one of the watchers recognized the man immediately: Grigory Lebedev, a known facilitator who arranged illegal border crossings. Lebedev had been under observation for months. The fact that a defense engineer met him just a week before an approved foreign trip was damning enough. The KGB didn't wait for more evidence. The report from Petrov, the upcoming travel, and the meeting with a suspected smuggler together, it painted a clear picture. On May 21st, the decision was made. The Kazakov family would be arrested before they could leave. That night, 2 black Volga sedans stopped in front of the building on Bukarestskaya Street. 6 officers in plain clothes climbed the stairs. Neighbors peeked through their door cracks, sensing the familiar dread of a KGB visit. When Anatoly opened the door, they identified themselves calmly. "You need to come with us." Elena appeared behind him, asking what this was about. The answer came coldly: questioning, routine procedure. As they stepped into the hallway, one officer took Dmitri gently by the shoulders. The boy was confused, calling out for his mother. Elena tried to reach for him, but another officer blocked her path. Dmitri was placed in a separate car. He never saw his parents again. By morning, Anatoly and Elena Kazakov were in separate KGB detention facilities. Dmitri was taken to a state children's home on the outskirts of the city. And the report, the one written by a police sergeant based on a child's innocent words, had done its work perfectly. In a country where every whisper could be a crime, it had taken only 2 sentences from a 7-year-old boy to destroy an entire family. The arrest of Anatoly and Elena Kazakov was swift, but it was only the beginning. Inside the grey corridors of the Leningrad KGB's Second Chief Directorate, the case labeled 4788K was now officially open. Its purpose: to confirm intent, identify collaborators, and determine the full extent of the defection conspiracy. For the officers involved, it was a standard operation, one among hundreds that passed through their hands each year. But for the Kazakovs, it was the slow machinery of the Soviet state grinding their lives into dust. Anatoly and Elena were placed in separate cells at 2 different detention facilities. They were denied communication with each other and their son. Interrogations began within hours of their arrest. For the KGB, truth was not a matter of discovery, it was a matter of pressure. They had the report from Sergeant Petrov, the surveillance notes, and the record of Anatoly's meeting with Grigory Lebedev, the suspected border facilitator. That was enough to build a narrative. Now, they needed confessions to complete it. Interrogations in 1,980 seconds. Leningrad followed a familiar rhythm: isolation, sleep deprivation, endless questioning. The officers never shouted. They didn't have to. They spoke with the calm authority of men who knew they were the law. Why did you meet with Lebedev? What were you planning in Bulgaria? Who else was involved? For 3 days, Anatoly denied everything. He said the meeting was coincidence, that he had only discussed work. He insisted the family's trip was innocent, approved through proper channels. But on the 4th day, something inside him broke. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the realization that denial would change nothing. He signed a statement confessing that he and his wife had planned to defect. He described the route Bulgaria to Yugoslavia, then into Austria, where they hoped to request asylum at a Western embassy. He said he knew it was illegal, that he was betraying his country, but he had done it for his son. I wanted him to live where he could speak freely, he told them, where he would not grow up afraid. Is the Rofik. When Elena was brought in for questioning, she too confessed. She spoke quietly, almost apologetically, describing the nights she packed photo albums and heirlooms, the small traces of a life they had hoped to rebuild elsewhere. She begged the interrogators to spare Anatoly. It was his idea, she said. I followed because I loved him. But the officers didn't care who started the plan. The decision had already been made. Under Article 64 of the USSR Criminal Code, treason to the state covered any act that harmed the security or independence of the Soviet Union, including attempts to flee abroad. For a defense sector employee, intent alone was enough. There were no mitigating circumstances. The penalty was death. Within weeks, a closed military tribunal convened. It lasted less than 4 hours. The evidence was presented: Anatoly's signed confession, Elena's corroboration, surveillance reports, and testimony from the arresting officers. There was no defense attorney, no witnesses, no appeal. The verdict: guilty of treason. The sentence: death by firing squad. Execution was carried out on the 2nd of July 1982 at dawn. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves outside Leningrad. Their names were erased from records, their employment files purged. Within 2 weeks, another family moved into the apartment on Bucharestskaya Street, as if the Kazakovs had never existed. Meanwhile, Dmitry was transferred from the temporary holding facility to a state-run children's home in the Novgorod region, nearly 200 kilometers away. He was 7 years old. The state described his parents as enemies of the people. He was officially reclassified as the child of traitors, a status that required ideological rehabilitation. When his grandmother, Klavdia Kazakova, arrived in Leningrad begging for custody, she was turned away. The state's reasoning was simple. Such children require re-education to ensure proper ideological alignment. Klavdia appealed again and again, writing letters to party officials, pleading that she was a loyal Soviet citizen who could raise him properly. Every request was denied. She was allowed to visit Dmitri only under supervision 30 minutes, once a month. During her first visit, he asked where his parents were. She didn't know how to answer. The case is closed, the authorities had told her. They will not return. So she lied. She told him they were away on a long trip, that they would come back when they could. He believed her. Children believe what they must. Over the next decade, Dmitri was moved between different institutions, a common practice designed to prevent emotional attachment. He grew quiet, withdrawn. He avoided other children. Teachers described him as intelligent but detached, obedient but unmotivated. He never caused trouble, never spoke of his family. In the eyes of the Soviet system, he was a success story, a boy properly reshaped by ideology. But inside, something in him had gone silent. As the years passed, so too did the Soviet Union. By the time Dmitri turned 18 in 1992, the empire that had destroyed his family no longer existed. The hammer and sickle had been lowered. The KGB had become a ghost of itself. And the files, all those sealed cases of traitors and defectors, were gathering dust in forgotten archives. That year, Dmitri was released from the care system. He was given a room in a communal apartment, a small government stipend, and a note instructing him to register for work. He found a job as a warehouse clerk, menial labor, but honest. To his co-workers, he was quiet and polite, almost invisible. No one knew his past, but in the evenings, he began to search. He went to government offices, libraries, and archives, trying to find out what had happened to his parents. Every inquiry met the same response. No information available. Files were lost, destroyed, or still classified. But Dmitri was patient. Like his father once had been, he was methodical, persistent. And in September 1993, he finally met someone willing to help a clerk in a dusty records office who took pity on him. She searched the old KGB files after hours and found case 4788K. She showed Dmitri the record, *arrest, the 21st of May, 1982. Charges: treason under Article 64. Verdict: death by firing squad. Execution, the 2nd of July 1982. And one final note, initial report provided by Sergeant Viktor Petrov based on information supplied by his son, Mikhail. Dmitri didn't need to read more. He remembered the courtyard, the wall, the afternoon he said, "We're going west." He understood, in one unbearable moment, that his words had killed his parents. That night, he walked for hours through the streets of St. Petersburg, the city that had once been Leningrad. He saw the same gray buildings, the same facades, now washed with new colors and promises of democracy, but it didn't matter. The past was still there, buried beneath the paint. He returned to his room, sat at his table, and wrote a short note. He wrote that he had learned the truth, that he was the one who had destroyed his family, and that he could not live with that knowledge. He didn't blame the Petrov family, nor the KGB, nor the Soviet Union. He blamed himself. On September 8, 1993, at the age of 18, Dmitri Kazakov took his own life. The machinery of the Soviet state was built to move with cold precision. Once a person became a name in a file, their fate was no longer human, it was procedural. For Anatoly and Elena Kazakov, the gears had already turned. There would be no escape, no appeal, and no redemption. Only the ritual of a system designed to make betrayal appear righteous. In the weeks after their arrest, both were interrogated separately at Kresty Prison, a facility known for breaking those who resisted. The rooms were sterile, windowless, and lit by a single bulb that burned through the night. The interrogators were polite, almost gentle. They offered cigarettes, tea, brief moments of kindness, then turned every word into evidence. Every silence became guilt. Anatoly tried to protect Elena, insisting the plan was his alone. But the KGB already knew the truth, or what they needed to call the truth. They had surveillance logs showing Elena shopping at odd hours, packing late at night, whispering on the phone. It was enough to prove complicity. The interrogators read excerpts from his own confession back to him, slowly, methodically. You admit to contact with Grigory Lebedev? Yes. You admit intent to cross into Yugoslavia? Yes. You understand that this constitutes treason? I understand. Obli par. Then came the question he couldn't answer. Who else helped you? Anatoly refused to name anyone. He knew that if he did, others, perhaps innocent colleagues, would vanish into the same grey system. His silence was his last act of defiance. Elena's interrogation followed the same pattern. Her examiner asked about her husband, about their motivations, about whether she understood the ideological consequences of her actions. When she finally broke down, she said softly, "We just wanted our son to grow up without fear." Those words were entered into the record, annotated by the officer, emotional justification, no political significance. Within weeks, the military tribunal convened in secret. No journalists, no family, no defense counsel. The proceeding lasted only 4 hours. By Soviet law, that was sufficient. The prosecutor's closing statement was brief. The accused sought to defect from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The accused held a position in a state defense enterprise, and thus possessed knowledge relevant to national security. Their intent to cross the border constitutes an act of treason under Article 64. The law allows only one sentence. The judge read the verdict without looking up from the paper: death by firing squad. At dawn on the 2nd of July 1982, the two were taken separately to an undisclosed execution facility outside Leningrad. The standard procedure was simple and impersonal. The condemned were told their appeal had been denied, that sentence would be carried out immediately. They were allowed to write a final statement. Both refused. Anatoly asked only one question before being blindfolded. "Will my son be told?" The officer answered, "The state will decide what he is told." The gunfire came seconds later. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, their records sealed, their names deleted from official archives. To the world, they no longer existed. To the system, justice had been served. Back in Leningrad, Dmitry lived in the children's home that the state called an institution for moral rehabilitation. He was told only that his parents had betrayed the motherland. For years, that sentence followed him like a shadow. Teachers treated him with suspicion, older children taunted him, and administrators referred to him only by his last name, never his first. Kazakov, line up. Kazakov, don't speak out of turn. He became a ghost in his own life. His grandmother, Klavdia, did what she could. She brought candy, photographs, small gifts, things that meant nothing to anyone else but were the last fragments of a vanished family. Every visit was supervised. She wasn't allowed to hug him until permission was granted. When she tried to speak about his parents, the overseer interrupted. "Comrade Kazakova, political topics are not appropriate. Iverpli." In August 1982, during one of those visits, Dmitry asked the question that haunted her for the rest of her life. "Babushka, when are Mama and Papa coming back?" She looked at him for a long time, unable to speak. Finally, she whispered, "Soon. They'll come back soon." It was a lie born from love and survival. For the next 11 years, Dmitry drifted through the Soviet care system, from Novgorod to Leningrad, from one institution to another. Each transfer erased a piece of his childhood. He stopped asking questions. He stopped dreaming. In a world where truth could destroy you, silence became his only defense. Then, the world itself changed. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell. The red flag came down from the Kremlin, and the empire of fear that had swallowed his parents collapsed into fragments of memory and bureaucracy. But freedom, for Dmitry, arrived too late. He was 18 by 1992, released from state custody into a country still learning what freedom meant. He worked in a warehouse, lived alone in a communal flat, and kept his past buried. Yet every time he passed an official building or saw a man in uniform, something inside him recoiled. He needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed him. For months, he filed requests to the new government agencies, searching for records that no one wanted to acknowledge existed. He lied when necessary, claiming he needed medical documentation or family certificates. Most clerks turned him away. Some pitied him, others simply didn't care. Until, one evening in September 1993, a woman in a records office agreed to help. She searched the old KGB archives after hours and found the case file marked 4788K. She didn't show him everything, only a summary sheet, but it was enough. He read the dates. Arrested the 21st of May 1982, executed the 2nd of July 1982. Then he saw the note that shattered him completely. Initial information provided via militia officer Viktor Petrov, based on report from minor child. Dmitry froze. He didn't need to ask which child. He remembered the courtyard, the spring sunlight, the way his friend Mikhail had listened so carefully. He remembered saying, "We're going west and not coming back." He understood, with perfect, unbearable clarity, that it was his own voice, his own innocent words, that had begun it all. That night, he walked the streets of St. Petersburg for hours. The new Russia around him was loud, chaotic, and hopeful, but he felt nothing. The city that had once been Leningrad still whispered in the corners, in the stone walls that had heard too many secrets. When he returned home, he sat at his small table and wrote a note in neat, deliberate handwriting. He didn't beg forgiveness. He didn't blame the state. He simply wrote, "It was my fault. I killed them with my words. On the night of September 8th, 1993, he hanged himself in his apartment. He was 18 years old. The next morning, his landlord found the body and the letter. The police filed a brief report. Cause of death, asphyxiation, no foul play suspected. No one mentioned the past. The Soviet Union was gone, and so was he. When the Soviet Union collapsed, thousands of secret files began to surface. Some revealed agents who had spied for the West, others, entire operations that had vanished into silence. But among those documents, Case 4788K was different. It wasn't about espionage or ideology. It was about a family, 3 names buried under bureaucracy, and a tragedy that had begun with a child's whisper. For years, no one spoke of the Kazakov case. The file sat untouched in the archives of the Leningrad KGB, sealed under matters of state security. When it was finally uncovered in the late 1992 by a historian researching Cold War-era trials, it drew little attention. No newspapers printed it, no official acknowledged it, just a brief article in an academic journal describing a family destroyed by an informant's report initiated by a child. To most readers, it was a historical curiosity. To those who understood the system, it was something far darker. It was proof of how totalitarian power didn't just control people, it used them against each other. How loyalty became a weapon and innocence could become an instrument of death. The story of Dmitry Kazakov is not one of villains and heroes. It's a story of ordinary people, each trapped by a logic greater than themselves. Viktor Petrov, the police officer who filed the report, believed he was doing his duty. For 2 decades, the Soviet state had taught him that vigilance was patriotism, that silence in the face of potential betrayal was complicity. He followed the rules, trusted the system, and filed the paperwork. In his mind, he had done what any loyal citizen should. He retired in 1991 with honors and died in 2003, remembered as a dedicated public servant. He never knew, or perhaps never allowed himself to know, what his report had set in motion. His son, Mikhail, the friend who had listened in the courtyard that spring afternoon, disappeared from public record. Some say he moved to another city, others that he left Russia entirely. He has never spoken publicly about the incident. No one knows if he ever discovered what happened to Dmitry or if, like so many others, he chose to forget. The facilitator, Grigory Lebedev, was eventually arrested in 1984 for unrelated charges and sent to a labor camp. He was released 10 years later and vanished. His name appeared briefly on a border registry in 1994, and then nothing. Like the others, he became another ghost of a vanished system. And what of Klavdia Kazakova, the grandmother who fought the state for her grandson? She buried Dmitry beside an unmarked grave she believed belonged to her son and daughter-in-law. Neighbors said she visited the cemetery every week until her death a year later. They remember her as a quiet old woman who talked to the graves as if someone was still listening. She was 76 years old when her heart finally gave out. After her death, the Kazakov name disappeared from the city entirely. No memorial was built. No plaque marked the place where the family had lived. Their apartment was renovated, reassigned, and the walls that had once held their whispers now echoed with new voices. History moved on, as it always does. Yet the story of the Kazakovs endures for one reason. It reveals how a system of fear sustains itself, not through open violence, but through participation, through the willingness of ordinary people to report, to comply, to believe that obedience is virtue, through children taught to inform, neighbors taught to suspect, and parents taught to hide. That was the genius and the horror of the Soviet surveillance state. It didn't need monsters. It only needed citizens. Because in such a world, truth itself becomes treason, and love between husband and wife, between parent and child, becomes the most dangerous secret of all. When the journalist who rediscovered the case wrote his final paragraph, he ended it with a question, not a statement. Can a child be guilty for what he cannot understand? Or is guilt itself just another weapon of the system that created him? Perhaps that is the only way to remember Dmitry Kazakov, not as a traitor, nor even as a victim, but as a child born into a country where every word could kill. A boy who loved his parents, trusted his friend, and was destroyed by both. He was 7 when he made a mistake. He was 18 when it took his life. And in between, he lived in a silence that belonged not to him, but to the empire that created it. The Kazakovs were one family among millions who lived and died in the shadows of the Cold War. Their story is not unique, but it is a warning. When fear becomes, this story, like so many others in our world, doesn't end here. If you found meaning in these reflections, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were 7 years old and someone asked you to keep a secret? Law and silence becomes safety. No one is truly innocent.